6 o'clock on the dot, so it should be coming up.
And the link.
I'll send it. Let me get this going because it's 6, and then I'll forward it to you. All right, we should be live now. Let me see. Everybody's messaging me. Okay, it says that we're live. Let me see. Okay, we're live on Facebook, it says.
They are live on Facebook, Lord.
All right. Good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are physically. Welcome to day 2 of our Free the 13th Amendment virtual rally. It's a second day of a 4-day event. I encourage everyone who is watching at home to take out your pen and paper. We have some very powerful speakers tonight who will be blessing us with their presence and all of their knowledge and wisdom and work. And so I just wanted to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Lulu, and I am an advocate for the incarcerated and elderly, as well as human rights. So without further ado, we will move into our first speaker this evening. It will be a platform conversation with 3 speakers, and we will have some questions answered. So please drop your answers or questions in the chat, and we look forward to getting to those as we go along this evening. Thank you for attending. And next we will have Max Prathis, an acting director for the Paul Coffey Abolitionist Center in Sumter, South Carolina, state operations organizer for the Abolish Slavery National Network, co-host and executive producer of Abolition Today. Max Prathis is a modern-day slavery abolitionist, activist, celebrated spoken word artist, and mentor. He's a visionary who doesn't mind speaking his mind and facing the ugly truths of modern-day slavery head on via the public platforms like social media, broadcast radio, spoken word, poetry, and videography. Max, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to everything you're getting ready to say.
Wow, I feel like I got the weight of my world on my shoulders today. And I'm not at my best. I have to admit that I'm dealing with pneumonia right now. So forgive me if my voice cracks a little, or I don't have the energy that I normally would portray. But what we're talking about right now is really something I'm very passionate about. I've been studying it almost daily, actually daily, for a decade and a half, this particular topic exclusively. And I found out certain things along the way that have blown my mind. And I was asked to talk about specifics of that today. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll add more to it afterwards. So what I was asked to speak about was the birth of the 13th Amendment. How did it come to be as we know it today? And also about the states that followed suit after the 13th Amendment was ratified and then incorporated similar exception clauses into their state constitution. So let's start with the beginning. The first appearance of an exception clause in a state constitution in order to allow for the legalized exploitation of prison labor was in Vermont in 1777. And I want to read that to you so you understand exactly where they were coming from and why it was put into that. And that exception clause is still in Vermont's state constitution today. It says, Article 1, all persons born free, their natural rights, slavery prohibited. That all persons are born equally free and independent, and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending life, liberty, acquiring possession, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Therefore, no person born in this country or brought from overseas ought to be holden by law to serve any person as a servant, slave, or apprentice after arriving at the age of 21 years, unless bound by that person's own consent, or after arriving to such age, or bound by law for the payment of debts, damages, fines, costs, or the like. So in 1777 in Vermont, you could become a slave for the like, whatever the hell that means, for debts, for damages. That was the very first appearance of the exception clause as we know it today. The next appearance that I'm aware of was in 1787 in the Northwest Ordinance, where they streamlined it down a little bit. And that says, Article 6, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same from whence whom labor is or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitives may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or services as aforesaid. Now, that's the 1787, 10 years later, and you can see that it was all about the slavery and the labor. The next time we saw it was in 1806 in Ohio's state constitution, which was very much the same. Then it came along again in 1861 during the Corwin Amendment. The Corwin Amendment is something that you should be aware of. It was supported by Abraham Lincoln prior to the original 13th Amendment that we're aware of today. And unlike these other exception clauses, the Corwin Amendment had no exception clause. It simply stated that slavery could not be removed by the Constitution in any way, shape, or form. It literally would guarantee that slavery would stay in the US Constitution forever. And this was supported by Abraham Lincoln. It was only a year after he had just written his letter to Justice Stevens, explaining to him only weeks prior to the secession that the South had nothing to fear about the North removing slavery or interfering with their slaves. He explained to Justice Stevens that the only difference between the North and the South was that in the South, they thought that slavery should be legal and available to all. And in the North, they thought it should be restricted. Now, when he said restricted, he was talking specifically about convict leasing, which the North, through Vermont, had already put into play throughout their systems. So, as you know, a civil war happened after that because the South didn't want convict leasing, they wanted slavery, just as they always known it. And the next appearance of that 13th Amendment came in 1861 in Alabama, which is in their constitution right now today, Section 32. And then finally in 1865, it appeared as we know it and was ratified in December of that year. The Emancipation Proclamation, which came out at the 1st of January, 1863, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, between the two of them, neither one of them ended slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to those who were in bondage in states that were in rebellion. So if you were in a state that was allied with the Union, you could keep your slaves. That's what most of the Emancipation Proclamation is about. And the 13th Amendment, as I have just showed you, had this well-worn exception clause, which had been used by those in the North and put into that as a compromise between the North and the South, the very compromise that Abraham Lincoln spoke about in his letter to Justice Stevens. Not long after that, and when I say not long after that, I mean as in weeks or months, they started using that convict lease system. And the way that they enforced it was through black codes and pig laws and vagrancy laws. All of these different things that were made to criminalize Black people, to demonize Black people who were formerly enslaved. And it just didn't just affect the formerly enslaved, it's also affected the freemen who lived in the North and were not slaves. But now they had to live under a criminalized life under this exception clause. At one point in Alabama, for instance, 10% of their income, the state's income, came through convict leasing prior to the Civil War. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, as much as 70 to 80% of their income came through convict leasing. Convict leasing is the topic that's going to be spoken about by my partner on Abolition today, Yusuf Hassan, tomorrow. So you'll hear a lot more about that. So I won't go too much into detail on that. But I will say that after the Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment had been passed, these laws were exploited to the point where I have heard recordings of former slaves talk about their lives. And there was this one gentleman by the name of Uncle Billy, they called him. And he told the story of how after the Emancipation and the 13th Amendment, that vagabonds, former slave catchers, would build log cabin prisons and then go out and capture as many Black people as they could under these new laws, because they were deputized now, and fill these log cabin prisons wherever they built them, and then sell them off to the mining companies and the railroad companies, where they would literally work them to death. There's a book called One Dies, Get Another by J. Mancini, Convict Leasing in the American South, 1866 to 1928. And in that book, John J. Mancini says that the only difference between convict leasing and slavery is with convicts so plentiful, they were seen as disposable. And that's what we saw from that point till this point, where people are seen as garbage people. And I'm quoting the sheriff out in Wisconsin right now, where he said, these are garbage people that we need to lock up forever. And that's what they did. So Black communities became like human shopping markets, where the slave catchers turned police now, legalized, would go into those communities and get as many bodies as they needed for whatever work project they were working on at the time. If a corporation like Tennessee Steel or Texas Oil said we need 30 laborers, they wouldn't go and get those laborers from the general population. They would contact the local prisons and have the prisoners sent to them, where they would work them to death. If you haven't seen the film Slavery by Another Name on PBS, is free. You should watch that. And you should also watch 13th by Ava DuVernay, and finish that off with Do Not Resist, a film about what will happen in the very near future in regards to modern slavery and human trafficking. 25 states, including Puerto Rico, the territory of Puerto Rico, have exception clauses in their state constitution right now. In Georgia, you can be enslaved for contempt of court. In Puerto Rico, the exception clause is written in Spanish. There's only 3 words that they use in order to bamboozle us with this wordplay trick. And those 3 words are unless, otherwise, and except. So out of all 25, that's what they use for the bamboozlement, except for prisoners duly convicted, unless prisoners are duly convicted, that type of language. And the problem with that 13th Amendment is that although it turns you into a slave if you're convicted of any crime, doesn't matter what you've been convicted of, as long as you're convicted, duly convicted, you become state property. What it doesn't do is return your rights to you as a human being, as a citizen, even after you've paid your dues, which is the reason that we have at least 5.5 million people in the United States today who have been disenfranchised because of felony convictions and cannot even vote. They can't collect housing assistance. They can't collect educational assistance. There's nothing that they can get that other normal people would be able to get. Even their rights can be violated at any time, because even though they paid their dues and served their time, according to the 13th Amendment, they are still property of the state. And this is why so many abuses occur within the prison systems itself. Because if you've been convicted of a crime, you're no longer applicable for your civil rights, for your human rights, for the rights bestowed upon you by the Constitution of the United States of America. The only rights that you have is what the prisons themselves dictate you should have. And hence, because of that, Eighth Amendment violations are rampant in states like Alabama and in Ohio and in Mississippi and Tennessee and South Carolina, where they are treating these men and women like animals, abusing them, brutalizing them. And even in cases where we've spoke with women of Tutwiler prison out of Alabama, where they're experiencing rapes and abuses at the hands of guards. One woman explained to us how she saw 10 births in prison, all by guards. And then the children were sent out to an adoption agency that was working with them, run by Russians. Yes, that is the case. So they're being raped in prison. The DOJ came in and inspected it, found out that the Eighth Amendment violations were correct. It was rampant. The same thing happened in the men's prisons. The DOJ came in and found out that they were, yes, systemically violating the Eighth Amendment rights, but to this day, nothing has come of it. Half of the guards who were raping those women in Tutwiler prison are still employed at Tutwiler's prison. Can you imagine being one of those women where the man that you have said has raped you or even fathered a child that you were forced to give up by you is right there still working with you every day, still taking care of you as a property of the state? Many of these states adopted this exception clause 30, 40, 50, in some cases as much as 100 years after the 13th Amendment was ratified. And I found a pattern within that as well. Let me just pull up my paper here real quick. For instance, I found that the states would first start using convict leasing. And then once it became profitable, they would legalize it in their state constitution. So for example, Arkansas, or let's say Alabama, they started using convict leasing in 1846. And then they put the exception clause in their constitution in 1861. Arkansas started using convict leasing in 1867. And then they put an exception clause in their state constitution in 1874. California started using convict leasing in 1851, and then they put an exception clause into their constitution in 1880. And all the way down the line, we see this repeated over and over again, that the reason they included this legalese with this exception clause was to allow them to legally exploit prisoners for free labor. And we have come to the 21st century now, where we've encountered a very new form of slavery. First, in antebellum America, it was all about free labor and sexual abuse and power. And then after antebellum America, during the convict lease period, it was all about corporations exploiting free labor with no repercussions of how they treated these people, literally working them to death. So the free labor was straight through the Emancipation and the 13th Amendment's ratification. But once we got up into the 1970s, something changed. And that began with the war on drugs. And they found that they could make more money by warehousing bodies than they could through convict leasing. They kept doing convict leasing. Officially, technically, convict leasing was supposed to have ended and was abolished in 1928, with Alabama being the last state to do so. But we all know that that did not happen. Right here in South Carolina, We had women's prisons that were making Victoria's Secret underwear in the 1970s. Right now, you have prisoners working through a corporation called Unicor that does nothing but provide labor and services provided by prisoners for pennies on the dollar. So they're still doing the convict leasing, even though they claim it was abolished. But now added to that, and much more lucrative, is the warehousing of bodies. In the antebellum period, that would have been senseless. Why would you warehouse bodies when you could exploit the labor? But now the trick is, and I always use the example of Khalif Browder, because many people are aware of Khalif Browder. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old boy who was incarcerated in Rikers Island when he was 16 years old under the accusation of stealing a backpack. He was held for 3 years and then released, and then he committed suicide. And his mother died not long after that from a broken heart. But for every year that they held Khalif Browder in Rikers Island, it cost the taxpayer $353,000. $353,000 a year to house one single 16-year-old boy. In California, the average cost to incarcerate an adult is upwards of $80,000 a year. I don't make $80,000 a year. I don't know anybody that's making $350,000 a year. But these are the costs that we as taxpayers provide to the Department of Justice to warehouse these bodies. And so the black codes that I spoke of earlier, the pig laws, the vagrancy laws, they're all still in effect today, with many of our cultural identities being criminalized. And I'll give you an example of that. Here in South Carolina, in Spartanburg, there's a law against sagging pants. If you have a pair of pants on that are 4 inches or more below your waist, you're subject to a $500 fine or 6 months in jail. The same law is in New Jersey. We're talking about sending people to prison for fashion now. And their bodies aren't even showing, the underwear is hanging, so you don't see any skin. So that means it's targeting a specific group of people based on their cultural attire. And it's also targeting men, because when women are showing skin, there's nobody crying about how that is, something that we need to criminalize. But let some men walk around with their pants hanging down, and all of a sudden they're worthy to go to prison. The same thing is happening with our homeless population. Our homeless population here in South Carolina and Columbia a couple of years ago, they decided to start making homeless courts. We have about 1,400 homeless people here, but we only have a facility that can manage a couple of hundred of them at the most. And so they criminalized everything about being homeless. And the reason they did that is because they have discovered that warehousing bodies is a lucrative way of earning revenue for a county or a city. So for every homeless person that they put into one of these cells or jails, they're worth $30,000 or $40,000 to the city. They're not worth nothing to them on the street, but they're worth $30,000, $40,000 if you put them into a cell. And we've listened to the experts and the politicians talk about why they want to build more prisons. Like in Nebraska, where Molina's at right now, there's a $450 million contract on the table to build a new prison. In Alabama, it's $800 million on the table to build new prisons over there. And when you listen to the politicians talk, they tell you that the reason they're doing this is because it creates jobs, it creates revenue, it creates construction opportunities, and they have X amount of jobs now, and they want X amount of jobs afterwards. At no point do they talk about criminality. They don't care how many criminals there is, because if there isn't enough to fill that prison, they will make more. And we've been working now in the United States with these for-profit private prisons, which have become some of the largest industries on the entire planet. And when I say largest industries on the entire planet, let me say it like this. The entire continent of Africa, on the entire continent, the largest private employer is G4S, which is a prison company. Here in the United States, the third largest employer is prisons in the United States. In Australia, all of their prisons are run by a private company called the GEO Group. The model that we've created here in the United States of this warehousing of bodies, which is our new form of convict leasing and slavery, has been adopted worldwide. Turkey, 3 years ago, said that they were going to build 264 new prisons in order to house dissidents, not criminals, dissidents. And they did that. And then you are familiar that Trump recently declared to pull out the troops that were protecting Kurds. And then Turkey right away started putting the Kurds into these prisons that they had built. This is the new form of slavery. You're not born a slave, but you may be born in an environment that creates the conditions for you to be enslaved, particularly high poverty, high crime areas. In New York, they have areas that are known as $1 million blocks, not because of the value of the buildings themselves, but because these high poverty areas generate $1 million a year through incarceration alone. Just by locking these people up, they turn that into $1 million blocks. And all of this is allowed through the 13th Amendment of the US Constitution. So our police have become slave catchers. Our prison guards are now overseers. And even you and I and anybody listening today can be a slave owner. And I say that because, again, of the private prisons. Once prisons were privatized, it allowed anyone in the world to purchase stock in the construction and maintenance of for-profit private prisons. And when you buy these stocks, you are not buying your stocks based on the buildings. You're not buying these stocks based on the management. You're buying these stocks based on the fact that these prisons will be filled from 80 to 100% occupancy at all times. And often the occupancy rates are much higher than that. Right now in Nebraska, there's 151% occupancy rate. The governor was forced to declare a state of emergency for the prisons because it's at such a high occupancy rate. In Alabama, their occupancy has been at times as much as 300%. Could you imagine a person enduring that type of environment during a pandemic where it's a 300% occupancy rate and you have no way to self-isolate or move away? You just have to wait for this thing to hit you. So this is the reason why the prisons are seeing more deaths than anywhere else. So I don't want to talk too long. I did cover the things that I said I would cover, but I just want to make sure that you understand what we're dealing with here. What we are dealing with in the United States is not a mistake. It's not an error over time. It's not legacies of slavery that still linger on. It was made to be this way. From the very beginning, it was constructed to be this way, to criminalize specific groups and then use them as resources, reusable resources, through incarceration. And now with the warehousing of bodies, it has exploded to a global phenomenon. We were just talking about Nigeria on our radio program the other day. Many people may be familiar with it. Nigeria is having protests about the secret police that they have over there, SARS. And during the protest, the military opened fire on them, killing several dozen from what I've been aware of. So I took a quick look and found out that Nigeria has 240 prisons. 200 of them were built in 1960, all in 1 year. In 1960, they didn't even have a concept of prisons until they were colonized. And now they're using these prisons as an effort to generate revenue through their own citizenry. The same thing happened in Haiti. After the earthquake in Haiti, when relief was needed the most, the United States offered to send a GEO group over there and build prisons as economic development programs. And they did. And those prisons run by the GEO group in Haiti now are among some of the worst human rights violations happening on earth. Just look it up on Google, you can see the videos of these things. It's absolutely mind-blowing. We've gone to war. with other countries for far less than what these prisons are doing all across the globe to us. Here in America, we have an opportunity to make a difference because we have this thing called the Constitution, the free speech. So we can share ideas, and we have an opportunity to be able to change the fate of our children's futures and our grandchildren's futures. And that's what we're doing here today by fighting against this crime against humanity. Not a mistake, a crime against humanity being done on purpose and targeting people based on race and class. And these are the reasons why we're attempting to remove these exception clauses from state constitutions across America, and eventually to remove it from the federal constitution as well. As long as slavery is legal, no one is safe. I'll conclude with that. Did I cover the time enough? Okay.
Thank you so much, Max. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head. So many different things. I think for myself, the biggest wake up was not understanding the timeline of when slavery was quote unquote abolished by, the 13th Amendment in 1865, but then understanding the Black codes and segregation and understanding the movement into convict leasing and mass incarceration. And those are all of the things that a lot of people really don't understand. And they also don't understand, that some of our local go-to restaurants and stores are places who are, benefiting from the convict leasing and benefiting from the prison labor. And I think that you spoke to quite a few. We do have some questions for you. So if you're around to answer those. Looks like the first question that I have is, where can a person find resources if they wanted to get involved?
Go to abolishslavery.us. We've established the Abolish Slavery National Network for those very purposes, where we are organizing along with these states all across America to remove these exception clauses. That's just step one. It's a very simple thing that is hard to argue against. Why would you have legalized slavery in your Constitution? Why wouldn't you have an end to slavery in your Constitution? So start there at abolishslavery.us. There's a sign up link right there where you can do that. If you represent a group, please use the contact us form. That way you can tell us about your group. If you're a representative of a state, that way you can tell us which state you represent so you can get involved. We have a number of state representatives on our team that are working to do this. This year, we have 3 states that are in the process, on the ballot, 2 of them, and 1 in the process of amending their constitutions. We have 2 more set up for 2021 and 2022, and we have as many as a dozen that are organizing right now to do the same thing. This is a movement that is happening. One of our hosts, Savannah, is a member of the organizations in Texas that's going to remove their exception clause. So start there at abolishslavery.us. And if you're interested in learning more about this system, because I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg on this. Like I said, I've studied this for a decade and a half, and I could study for the rest of my life and still never know it all. I would suggest that you listen to us at abolitiontoday.org, our radio program, every Sunday. Check out the archives. We go into detail on each aspect of this system.
Thank you. Looks like there's a couple of comments and there's one last question. I wanted to go ahead and get to you. I will read that. Give me just 1 second. Something changed here. It says, how can activists research findings on how the state allocates its fundings per incarcerated person? So beyond where they can find the list of all the different states that have various expenditures for incarcerated persons, where can they locate that information?
2 of the resources that I've been using, very dependable resources, are Equal Justice Initiative and also Prison Policy. So prisonpolicy.org, I believe it is. and EJI. Those two do a lot of the research in order to let us know exactly what the cost of incarceration are and how much per state. So you can literally just click a drop-down menu, click your state, and see all of these different costs. There's several other groups and organizations that provide this information as well. And a lot of that will be found at the Abolish Slavery Network website in the very near future. So you'll have these tools at your fingertips.
Awesome. Thank you so much for giving us this information. I hope that around and answer some of the questions that may come on the back end.
Yes, I will.
We've gone through our call list. Great, wonderful. So I will move along to our next speaker. Thank you so much for your time, Max. Our next speaker, his name is Heshma, and he is part of the Abolish Legal Slavery in America movement, and that will speak for itself. So if you can just listen along, you will hear his information and what he is going to share with us today. He's spent 30 years in prison, 20 years in solitary confinement. He's the founder of Amend the 13th, creator of the Autonomous Infrastructure Mission, author of multiple books, articles, community. One moment. Hang tight with me, everyone. It'll be just one moment.
Sorry, guys, trying to get the PowerPoint back up. Having a few technical difficulties. I might have to start it over, sorry.
I mean, I have some other comments that I can read. If we can do that, I'll do that.
Yeah, let me, do you want to do that?
Sure, go ahead and get it set up and then I'll take care of that.
Okay.
Let me get over there. All right, so Max, it looks like the comment said urban ghettos are another form of plantation to historically extract capital and disenfranchise poor Black and brown people.
Is that a question name for me?
I believe so. It's just a comment based upon the conversation shared with us. I
When
think
we talk
that,
about systemic, that's what we mean by systemic. Poverty is not something that happens, it's manufactured and maintained. They keep these communities in poverty. One of the ways that they do that is by removing jobs. They did that to my community. The Clintons did that to my community. They took out all the factory jobs and they sent them overseas where people were getting paid $1 an hour or 80 cents an hour. And once the jobs are gone, the city falls into poverty. And where there's poverty, there's drugs and alcohol. Where there's drugs and alcohol, there's crime, which creates the conditions for enslavement. And then they send in these hordes of police who do nothing but run around in these cars that are nothing but shopping carts, dropping bodies in them and plopping them into these prison jail cells where they've criminalized them and forced them in these conditions in which they exist. So that's part of the systemic nature of this.
right. I agree. And I think that people don't realize how systemic it is, because a lot of people don't even realize that there were, people actually in positions of power who were imprisoned for abuse of power, the judges and police officers who helped and assist with, to say, that grocery cart shopping of Black men. So I think that that's something that a lot of people just don't need to understand the full concept behind. If they look at it as though everyone who is imprisoned or incarcerated is because they have committed some crime, and not to say that many of them have not, but at the end of the day, there seems to be a despairing difference.
Yes. Just as a note, I couldn't hear Hashima. Were you having audio issues with that?
Yeah, she is.
Okay. Yeah, I did the math today. I might have mentioned it about public order and drugs, making up 800,000 bodies that are in prisons, but that's not the end of it. In Massachusetts, just a few years ago, one of the lab technicians, it had been discovered that she was falsifying drug and alcohol reports with false positives, and she'd done it to as many as 60,000 people. And the reason that she was falsifying these drug and alcohol reports is because that there's an incentive, a cash incentive that is given to either the lab technician's office as a whole or to the lab technicians themselves for every positive result that they provide. So for an extra $10 or $15, she was throwing away people's lives.
Yes.
Literally 60,000 cases. And there's 14 states that have that very same incentive that I'm aware of. 14 states that incentivize positive drug and alcohol reports. So if you're on probation and you fail your drug report, guess what happens? You go to prison.
Yeah. And unfortunately, people don't understand that. And I'm glad to see, in regards to those types of things are being exposed, because I think that there is a greater need to expose a lot of the misappropriation and the mishandling of funds in regards to, just like you said, if you're only worth $20,000 on the street, but you're worth $80,000 locked up, you do the math. Capitalism plays a huge role in all of this, as we have seen how it functions in our country in regards to even just this pandemic. So
Yes,
hopefully.
Nathan said that voter disenfranchisement is another incentive. He's absolutely right. They said there's as many as 5.5 million. I think they're underselling it. I believe that it's closer to 10 million people in this country who cannot vote because of a felony conviction. That is a lot of Black men who can't vote, because the majority of those being incarcerated are Black men. 94% of the prison population are men. 40% of the prison population are Black men. They only make up less than 6% of the national population. So when you take away that many voters from that small population, you are literally denying the entire population its rights.
Yeah, and if we could get people to a place of understanding that they wouldn't be denying your voting rights if they didn't have a certain power. So thank you, Max, for kind of helping us out during our A little technical snafu. I appreciate everyone's patience. I think we're ready to go with Heshma's information.
Abolishing slavery.
Still can't hear it.
Okay. Savannah. Okay, so looks like unfortunately we have some difficulty with Heshma's information. We may need to go directly to our next speaker. So give me just one moment. We'll get that set up and I'll introduce her to you all. Let's see. All right, so thank you guys so much for your patience during this technical glitch that we're experiencing. There's nothing in this world that's perfect, and so I hope you didn't think I was gonna be either. So up next, I have Melina, and she has some amazing work and dedication that she's put into this effort. And Melina works for a small nonprofit dedicated to advancing public education in Nebraska. She has previously worked as an organizer and a consultant for political campaigns. For the last several months, Melina has been volunteering to educate voters in Nebraska about Amendment 1, which will finally prohibit slavery, period. She is a member of the Abolish Slavery Network, and I look forward to all of the information that Melina is looking to share with us. I thank you guys for your patience, and Melina, thank you for taking it over.
Thank you all. I'm really happy to be here. And I'll be pretty brief, but I'm happy to answer any questions people may have. So Nebraska, like many other states, never actually finished abolishing slavery. And to this day, our state constitution permits slavery if it's used as punishment for a crime. And we adopted that language way back in 1875, actually, at which time it was modeled closely, of course, after the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And also, like many other states, Nebraska exploited that loophole through convict leasing programs. In fact, our state government used the forced unpaid labor of incarcerated people to construct our second state capitol building. And this is really key because what I found through this work is that there's a really common misconception here in the Midwest and elsewhere that slavery isn't an issue here and now because it was never an issue here. And that's an education problem that then translates to an awareness problem when we're trying to pass these abolitionist constitutional amendments. When we're students, we learned that there were slave states and non-slave states, Confederate and Union. And while it's true that Nebraska was a non-slave territory and that we didn't become a state until after the Civil War had ended, slavery was a problem here and is still a problem. Anti-slavery bills were repeatedly tried and vetoed here. And we have more than one census that shows us that a quarter of Nebraska's Black population in 1860 was enslaved. So much for being a non-slave state, right? And of course, I already mentioned the convict leasing that came after and that continued here until at least the middle of the last century. So fast forward then to the spring of 2019, last year, and Senator Justin Wayne of Omaha introduced LR1CA, which would finally remove the exception clause from our Constitution that still allows slavery. And it did advance here as it did in Colorado and in Utah with unanimous support from our state legislators, which means that now in 2020, Amendment 1 is on our ballots for the people of Nebraska to decide. And Nebraska is unique. We're the only state with a unicameral legislature, and it purports to be nonpartisan. But still, we saw here what they saw in Colorado and in Utah, that it's not a red or a blue issue, it's really a moral one. And although I hope that most Nebraskans are going to agree, it's beyond past time that we remove this language. I do have concerns about how confusing the language on our ballots is. We saw what happened in 2016 in Colorado. Voters were confused, and I worry that we'll see something similar transpire here, but I am hopeful. On the other hand, I also don't have any illusions that passing Amendment 1 is the end of this fight or any fight. There's still a lot of states to go that have this language. Nebraska is also one of the most overcrowded prison systems in the country, second only to Alabama. So once we pass this, there's a lot more to be done, but it doesn't make passing it any less important. So that's why I've been volunteering these past several months and collaborating with the Abolish Slavery National Network to get out the vote for eliminating slavery in Nebraska.
You're on mute, Lulu.
Yay, Melina.
You're on mute, Lulu.
Oh, thank you so much, Melina. That was so awesome. I really look forward to hearing a positive and all of your hard work and dedication. A lot of people really don't understand the efforts that go into the work that a lot of us are doing, especially, you know, the things that you have done. So I just want to give you a shout out and a kudos for all of that. I think that it really speaks loudly to, you know, the character of those who fight for those who don't necessarily have a voice in the system that we are in currently. And I thank you for sharing that with us. I do think that this is overall giving not myself, but giving people who are listening an opportunity to say, hey, there are different places where we can become involved in helping to be change makers. because I think that overall what happens in our society is that people are only concerned with once every 4 years. So I think that you coming on, Max also speaking tonight, is showing us that so many more opportunities for us to get in this thing and fight, boots on the ground. And there are people who are already doing the work, and we can join forces because we know that we are stronger together as leaders. So thank you so much, Melina. And her name, for anyone who is listening, because I don't think I said the whole name, her name is Melina Cohen. And I thank you for all the work that you're doing over in Nebraska.
Thanks,
Thank you
Lulu.
for the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I hope you can stick around. I've got some questions that have come in for both you and Max. I think Savannah is a go ahead and play the recording for Heshma. And so we'll just listen to that at this time, and then we'll take it from there with some questions. So thank you all. For those who are watching, we really hanging in there with us.
First of all, thank you all for your patience. One thing I've learned in this work is that nothing goes as planned, and we improvise, right? So we won't be having a PowerPoint. However, I feel that it's super important for Heshma's voice to be a part of this presentation tonight. So I will be playing his voice recording at this time.
Founder of Amendment 13th, Abolish Legal Slavery in America movement. The most enduring legacy of destruction and human misery in history is the legacy of legal slavery in America. Its attendant prejudices and unequal relationships have persisted through every evolution of American productive and social life. It is preserved in law and enshrined in the very structure of American institutions, casting its specter of hate and hierarchy across the lives of millions over the course of centuries. From the slave codes to the black codes to the legal slavery provision of the 13th Amendment and the thousands of civil death laws which derive their legal authority therefrom, America has made a mockery of the concept of freedom and justice for all by ensuring it is always denied to some. Of the many economic, social, and psychological components that have historically made up the concept of slavery, involuntary servitude remains its central and enduring tenet. For the United States of America in particular, and the system of capitalism in general, in laws to exploit the capture and bondage of human beings has always been an economic imperative in the United States. America is and has always been a slave state. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Following the close of the Civil War, the industrial application of involuntary servitude used in coal mining and iron production by the former Confederate states provided an impetus for Southern states to immediately leverage the slavery provision of the 13th Amendment. In doing so, Southern whites re-elevated their economic and political fortunes, which had been devastated by the loss of the war and the imposition of Reconstruction. For them, the permissibility of involuntary servitude as punishment for quote-unquote duly convicted criminals provided a justification for modifying their laws that effectively criminalized the very existence of new applicants. The very nature of criminality was yet again redefined to justify the exploitation of the oppressed by this nation. Absurd statutes such as vagrancy laws, labor contract laws, obscene language laws, employee discharge paper laws, malicious mischief laws, all criminalized Black life in post-emancipation America. From the late 1860s to the Civil Rights era, this series of statutes, collectively known as Jim Crow law, transformed Southern courts, law enforcement, jails, and prisons into the new mechanisms of industrial slavery in America, formerly known as the convict lease system. By the end of Reconstruction, every former Confederate state had empowered corporate and private lessees of this system to control nearly all of the functions of the traditional machinery and imprisonment. U.S. Sugar Company, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Rail Company, Newcastle Coal Company, Pratt Consolidated, U.S. Steel, and thousands of other corporations, small businesses, farmers, and government officials, tens of thousands of new African men, women, and children to death. According to the first biennial report of the Board of Inspectors of Convicts, Montgomery, Alabama, September 1st, 1884 to August 31st, 1896, 20% of convicts died in the first 2 years, 35% the following year, and almost 45% in the fourth. Conditions in these coal mines, iron furnaces, and lumber mills were like visions from Dante's Inferno. Brutal beatings, rapes, starvation, torture, and horrendous, filthy working conditions were the norm. A cabal of capitalists made up of white farmers, local law enforcement and judiciaries, and the white supremacist society that supported them all lived in a veritable wonderland of profiteering from involuntary servitude until social and political conditions changed once again. Precipitated by returning new African World War II veterans and new social attitudes developed by some whites during the periods of conflict with fascist regimes, U.S. politicians were forced to make reforms in the application and exploitation of involuntary servitude. In response to the tactics employed in the Civil Rights Movement and the cultural shifts ushered in by the anti-war and later the Black Liberation Movement, the U.S. moved from Jim Crow apartheid and lynch law to the Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO, and the Omnibus Crime Control Act, both of which legalized crimes against humanity for the state while criminalizing civil disobedience and collective resistance for the people. Once again, the oppressed, poor, and intentionally underdeveloped members of this nation experienced dehumanization at the hands of the judicial machinery for daring to challenge the state. I often speak of America as being a locked, anti-poor society, a society that practices conscious dehumanization of the nationally oppressed, the underclass, and the lumpen. This warped social perspective provides the psychological and statutory impetus for the progressive expansion of legal slavery in America into the prison industrial slave complex we know today. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the prison population rose from under 100,000 in 1925 to over 2.2 million in prison today, and another 7 million under some form of state control. This influx of human beings under the social control of a single state industry hasn't been seen since the shadow slave era. The capitalist exploitation of social control for the private accumulation of financial gain has led to tens of billions of tax dollars being poured into hunting, capturing, detaining, trying, convicting, and imprisoning people. It is a system that has welded corporate interests of every sort into a single cabal of business and government for the purpose of economically and politically exploiting criminalization and human bondage. Though the modern economic model of the prison industrial slave complex is primarily geared toward maximizing the portion of general tax funds, correctional departments, and private prison concerns, also benefit from the maintenance of involuntary servitude, making the incentive to curb the practice next to nothing. There are two primary branches of the average correctional budget. One, security and operations, and two, administration and staff. Security and operations is the cost associated with maintaining the physical structures of the prison and supplying it, powering it, ensuring all the material and equipment for security, care of prisoners, and functions is handled, while administration is associated with the salaries and benefits paid to prison staff. For prison industrialists, the name of the game is ensuring the minimum is spent on operations while the maximum goes into the pockets of administration and staff. This means kickbacks, ensuring that the maximum amount of tax dollars are allotted to administration pay and corporate contracts. In the South, where correctional budgets are relatively small, most of the prison's functional and supply needs are met by prison labor. In prisons across the South, from those in Alabama to Parchman Prison in Mississippi to Angola Work Farm in Louisiana, prisoners languish in the fields growing food that will supply their meals, making the cost to feed these modern-day slaves negligible. It is no different in Texas and Florida. In Georgia, not only are prisoners working in the fields and tears, but they are charged a fee just to have their funds held in the prison accounts. In the South, the chain gangs and slave drivers are still alive and well. In states like California, which has a much larger correctional budget, costs for preparing and serving food to prisoners, cleaning and maintaining cell blocks and prison yards, washing laundry and clerical duties are offset by employing prisoners for little to no pay. For more industrial scale exploitation of involuntary servitude, California's Prison Industrial Authority, or PIA, uses prison labor to make a wide range of products such as soap, bread, clothing, furniture, glasses, and even lenses farmed out to companies like LensCrafters for pennies on the dollar. Each year during wildfire season, hundreds of California prisoners man the fire lines, battling wildfires to preserve the lives and property of Californians. Ironically, after years of risking their lives fighting these wildfires, when they are finally released, they can't even get a job at the local firehouse in the communities they just saved, or anywhere else. Why then do prisoners not strike? Why do they not let these crops rot in the fields? Why do they not let prison staff mop the floors, cook the food, do the laundry, and milk the cows? The answer is simple. It is a crime for prisoners to refuse to work. Prisoners are slaves. If prisoners don't work, they are subject to rule violation reports, solitary confinement, and extensions of their sentences. In America, prisoners are slaves of the state. For example, California Code of Regulations, Title 15, Section 3048 states, every able-bodied person committed to the custody of the Secretary of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is obliged to work as assigned by department staff and by personnel of other agencies to whom the inmate's custody supervision may be delegated. Section 3041A goes on to state, inmates must perform assigned duties diligently and conscientiously. Inmates must not pretend illness or otherwise evade attendance or avoid performance in assigned work, education, and programs, or encourage others to do so. In the state of California, in order to be eligible for half-time, phone access, your time, canteen privileges, and anything else, you have to work as outlined in sections 3043, 3043.2. The latter, which states, the award of good conduct credits requires an inmate to comply with department regulations and local rules of the prison and perform duties assigned on a regular and satisfaction. I can think of no greater compulsion to do work you have no desire to do than the opportunity to gain your freedom faster and avoid the torture of solitary confinement. Involuntary servitude is fundamentally inhumane and only serves to reinforce the condition of historically oppressed people as the laborers whose production is appropriated by his or her masters. This exploitation is at its core a social control mechanism, relies on legalized dehumanization. Slavery and involuntary servitude for anyone, even those convicted of a crime, is itself criminal, morally repugnant, and indefensible. The United States, to my knowledge, is the only nation that maintains a legal provision by which its own citizens can be reduced to slaves of the state. I and those of like mind are abolitionists. We have little interest in improving prison conditions and lead instead towards ending the oppression of man and woman by man and woman, upon which imprisonment is based. Abolition of legal slavery provision of the 13th Amendment would reinforce the human right of prisoners to peacefully protest torture and other state-sponsored abuses. The U.S. has traditionally criminalized opposition and resistance to the crimes it is committed against its own. In classic authoritarian reasoning, it is not the inhumanity of slavery, driving indigenous nations from their homes on the reservations, or Jim Crow apartheid, which was criminal. It was resisting against these historic atrocities that was criminalized. Today, it is not the inhumanity of systematic mass incarceration, involuntary servitude, and civil death that is deemed criminal. It is our organized resistance to these inhumane practices that is deemed an offense. Sisters and brothers, do you not see the correlations? Do you not see that the restoration of our humanity by abolishing the basis of our humanization is the first step to ending our oppression? Understand, legal slavery in America is not a prison issue or a constitutional issue, or even a solely social issue. It is an issue of the underlying social structure of America itself and what we are willing to do to change it. The reason legal slavery in America has endured so long is because the institutions of our society have preserved it. Because we have not, with one voice, declared its demise, because we have not, with one resolve, moved against the unequal social, economic, and political relationships that maintain it. that the United States for centuries has not been willing to abandon involuntary servitude or other components of slavery is the best proof that it is the very nature and structure of American society and ideology that must be challenged and changed. Until we have the political courage and moral fortitude to challenge with a victorious revolutionary will the unequal social, economic, political, cultural, and military relationships upon which our collective oppression is based, the struggle for a more free, just, and equal society, a new society, will continue. It is my sincerest hope that you will join us in this struggle. Think on these things. They are cause for great meditation.
Thank you so much, Savannah, for Heshma's voice to be heard. How powerful. I'm just sitting here trying to figure out what piece I want to pull from that and kind of move forward, right? I think that we all can just give me a second. Let me swallow my spit down or something, because that was really deep. That was really deep. And I'm a woman of many words, and I'm kind of stuck right now. So I can imagine those of us who are not as well versed in this path, in this walk, in this challenge, in this journey that we all are all venturing on to try to be a part of this fight with Heshma and other people whose voices have been silenced just by the way that things are up in this country. It's really touching to hear just in that way. It's just it's a lot for me. So I have some questions. If anyone has questions directly for Heshma, I ask that you please note that on your message. We'll get those questions to him, and we'll have to filter those to him because he is on the inside. And so I do have some questions now that I can ask, in hopes that Max can help me get those answered tonight. I thank you all for your patience, but I do think that it was worth the wait, right? I think everybody will agree on that. And so I will say a first question, and it kind of goes along with what Heshma was speaking about, and it was a question that was posed to us. And maybe Max, if you can answer, or Melina, wherever you guys feel that you can kind of fit in. I have a few questions, so if it's not your question, don't worry about it. The question said, as someone who is currently incarcerated in a state that leases prison labor to multi-billion-dollar corporations, is it better for them to use the viable strategy to use labor as a negotiation tool? Because what Heshma was saying is basically you don't have a choice, but without dealing without the repercussions, you don't have a choice to whether or not you want to all these kind of conditions. But if these are companies that have to things that have to be fulfilled, how would one speak to those who are incarcerated being actually able to leverage that labor to help them kind of achieve the rehabilitative interest that they have? And I've heard multiple times over and over again that there are certain places, there are no rehabilitative efforts. It is just a warehousing. How, and what we're most afraid of as people on the outside is that these criminals are going to just come back out and they're going to ravish our houses like something we've seen on TV. But for those of us who understand that these are men and women and human beings on the inside who have, in many cases, been locked away for years and years, decades at a time, and they're not getting any form of rehabilitative efforts, how do you think that they can leverage the labor that they are called to do without option in many cases, way to say, hey, we'll give you labor, but we're looking for rehabilitation. How can we help them to kind of be that voice, or be that voice for them with the things that we're asking in regards to freeing the 13th? So that's a question. Max, if you have an answer,
Yes.
let me know.
We have had several, well, first let me say, I understand what you're dealing with behind bars in a prison that has an economy where you have to buy things. Like, you don't have a choice. You got to buy your toothpaste and shampoo and your sneakers and your socks, and this money is needed. So a lot of times these brothers and sisters will work for pennies because pennies is all they're being offered. And there's an economy and they have to live. They have to provide for themselves, and they don't have any money in the commissary. Nobody's sending them any money, and it's the only chance for them to get something to be able to sustain themselves. So I understand the incentives and the problems that you're dealing with. But I got to give a shout out to the Free Alabama movement, who helped show us the way by organizing several national prison slave labor work strikes. The last one was 2017, I believe, or 2018 actually, and that included as many as 24 prisons across America who stopped working for as much as a month long. And from what I understand, it cost the state of California upward of $100 million in revenue. And other states, it cost millions of dollars in revenue because they had become dependent upon this prison slave labor. In California, they have twice as many factories built into the prisons as they do prisons. You even have call centers for places like AT&T, where if your phone has a problem and you got to call up to get service, it's very likely you could be talking to somebody who's doing 30 to life and making 11 cents an hour in a call center inside a freaking prison. So organized labor denial is the way to go. If you can get the rest of the people in that particular prison to do it with you, it would add much more weight to your demands in this case. So prior to slavery becoming illegal in your state, this is an effective tool that we have shown can be used effectively all across America. So yes, denying your labor is definitely a powerful tool. Doing it by yourself may not be as effective as if you were able to do it in concert with those around you.
All right, thank you. I also have Binu on from the Free Alabama movement, and I want to give him an opportunity to speak to that as well. That's something he wanted to kind of add on to that. Thanks for that, Max. That's just a question I just don't have the answer to. So I think that was a really good comeback for it.
Yes.
Binu, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was a great question. The part that I wanted to just add on to that, because when we started out in Free Alabama movement organizing these work strikes, that's what we were using it for. We were leveraging our labor as a negotiation tool. But what we have grown and evolved to understand is that there's nothing to negotiate anymore on this issue. Like Brother Max said, when you ask the question as it related to leveraging labor towards rehabilitation, okay, what Max pointed out earlier and Brother Heschman pointed out is that for most people, there's actually nothing to be rehabilitated from. You can't be rehabilitated from being Black. You can't be rehabilitated from poverty. And so when you start talking about rehabilitation, it presupposes that the people have actually done something wrong or something criminal. But a lot of these things that people are being incarcerated for are not actually crimes that deserve punishment. There are a lot of people, the majority of people in prison do not deserve to be here for the things that they have been convicted of. Like Brother Max pointed out with just the sagging pants, by way of example. That's not something that a person should be incarcerated for. So if they are incarcerated for that, how do you rehabilitate them from it? The conditions that cause people to to violate these statutes and laws that have been criminalized. You know, a drug addict, you know what I'm saying? These people don't need prison rehabilitation style of program, because these institutions were never created to rehabilitate. They are not suited for that. So when you say that the labor is used to force them to create rehabilitation programs, well, if we start emphasizing and focusing on rehabilitation programs, then we start legitimizing the overall system. We legitimize the concrete, we legitimize the batons, we legitimize the pepper spray, we legitimize the profits that are being made simply as a compromise for rehabilitation on its face. But even with rehabilitation in a lot of states, as Brother Heshima pointed out, Alabama also has a statute. It says neither good conduct or performance of work duties are grounds for release. So even with rehabilitation, people are still not being able to get our way out. So the concept of work strikes has to also evolve. I have a mentor that said to me that if you are in prison, you should never work a job. And so that's what we have to get to. We have to get to the point where we're not striking any longer for any type of negotiating tool or strategy. We simply have to understand that we are here for one reason and one reason only. It's not for the crime, because this government that incarcerates us is committing a crime in it of itself by putting us here under the laws that we're being placed here. So we cannot negotiate for anything anymore, except for total and complete abolition of slavery. And so that's what our labor has to represent, not a work strike anymore. It has to be the complete eradication of the institution of slavery. And that's the start, because that's what everyone is here for. When it's about profits, when people come to the table to make money, that's what they're here for, is to make money. And our labor is only the first step. We haven't talked about the boycott aspect, and I don't want to get into that and try to dominate the themes that have already been spoken. I have opportunity tomorrow. But today, when we're talking about labor, and specifically to your question in rehabilitation, a lot of people in prison do not need rehabilitation. We need freedom. We need freedom from oppression, freedom from poverty, freedom from being targeted and criminalized because of the color of our skin, because of the conditions that we have been put in that we never had any control over. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, to try to bring the conversation up to speed about how the exploitation is being going on, and how even we sometimes fall into some of these traps and fall into these conversations. But we are our brother's keeper, and we have each other's back. And so I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for jumping in and giving us that input from your perspective. It holds much value. Appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of the other questions that were posed in the chat. One of the questions, and Binu, feel free if you would like to answer. Is systematic racism integrated in our education to create more jobs than for us to create more businesses? Anybody can take a stab at that.
Melina, would you like to?
I think
I
I
missed
missed.
part of the question. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It says, is systematic racism integrated into our education to create more jobs than for us to create more business? So you guys get it? Or do you think that it's more important for them? Is education created for people of different socioeconomics to be workers, as opposed to as opposed to having ownership and entrepreneurship, and being?
Well, absolutely. I think that the education system in America teaches people to go and get a job. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That's why the majority of people have jobs. When you look at the Black community in America, we're surrounded and occupied by external forces. The fast food restaurants, we don't own these. The used car lots, we don't own these. The convenience stores, we don't own these. The little 5 and dime shops that sell the little clothes and all of these, we don't own any of these things. And for the majority of us, and just speaking from the public school system, the education that we receive Entrepreneurs is a word that I never heard in school. Owning a business is something that I was never introduced to. Financial literacy, financial management is something that I was never exposed to in the traditional curriculum inside of the public school. So absolutely, they orientate us towards this. When people come out of college with thousands and thousands of dollars worth of debt, they've never had a business management course. You know, we're taught fundamentally in the system to go and look for jobs, and the places where they educate and teach people the other side of how this country works is very elite. It's very exclusive. It's very hard for people to get into because these people control world resources, and they don't have the door open for anyone and everyone to just walk right in. But it goes back to this issue that we're talking about with the 13th Amendment. You know, a slave was not taught how to own a plantation. The slave was taught to work on the plantation. And so it's just the construct of capitalism, of imperialism, the way that we live in these societies, that they have classes and structures for everyone. And there's a structure at the top where they call the 1%, and then they call it the 3%. And then you have it on down until you have whatever percentage category that you fall in. But when whatever category that you fall in will define your existence unless something happens that allows you to break out of it. And so when we're born into these impoverished communities that were created, these communities were created. And when they created them, they created the school system that will be in existence right here in this community. And so the educational curriculum is set by people who have an agenda, who have a purpose, who are part of a system. And so that's just what they call education in America. So yes, absolutely, our education, we were enslaved by our education. You know what I'm saying? These are where the processes started. It starts at Head Start. It starts in the schools. It starts in middle school and high school. And when you have these guidance counselors and stuff, these people are always talking about getting a job and doing this. But whatever it is, when they talk about education, it's always about getting a job. And that's why it's so important. You know, it's been dominating conversation recently. I've been following it closely. Just the premise of what Ice Cube is talking about with this contract with Black America. Just the premise of it, you know, whether you agree with what all he's saying or you agree with where he's coming from, it has the components of independence embedded into the conversation. And so it's very important for us to understand how important it is for us to have control of our own education system, to be independent, to have an independent curriculum, and to teach us in the areas where we're suffering. You know, so if there is an education curriculum and it doesn't answer these questions, is not teaching you how to raise your people, how to come up out of oppression, then one, you're not in control of it. And two, the role that you will play in the overall economy of this country will be defined for you within your curriculum of education.
I will jump in if that's okay.
Yes, please, go ahead.
You'd mentioned when you introduced me, but for those that didn't hear or forgot, my day job is actually working in education policy. So the original question asks, you know, is there systemic racism in our education system? Yes, there is. The school to prison pipeline is very real and very damaging. On the other hand, public education is the only system that guarantees a free, fair education for all students, no matter what. Is it failing some students, some communities? Absolutely. But I think we need to be really wary of who is advocating for school privatization. They often wrap their agenda in a language of the civil rights movement. But we know from the evidence that exists that things like school vouchers and charter schools, if not done correctly, are actually extremely harmful, and in particular to the very people they claim to help. Nebraska is one of the only 3 states that doesn't have charters or vouchers right now. Though there are efforts from people like Betsy DeVos, the Koch brothers, the Walton family, and on down the list. So we're watchful of that, and we're watchful of what their true intentions are. Absolutely, public school system is far from perfect, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But in the same way that prisons don't rehabilitate poverty, I think we often also ask that of our schools, and they can't solve those issues either on their own with less and less support from the government. So just some thoughts.
Okay, if I could just follow up behind that just briefly, like when you said if these private schools and whatnot, if they're done correctly, okay, in that statement within itself, you know what I'm saying, who's going to define what is correct? Because like if the communities who are impacted and who have the needs are not part of the curriculum, they're not part of the process, then it is not legitimate. The process is not legitimate. And then two, what can we actually expect from these people who are coming in and saying, hey, this is the private school, this is the curriculum? Because, you know, like I said, the education system that we're receiving is what's enslaving us off the top. And if the people who are being victimized by this are not going to be the people who receive the funds and then are allowed to create the schools ourselves, then how do we ever get out of the process? Or how do we say these people 100% have our best interest when these people have already been here and what they've done so far has not worked? And we can look at the curriculum and say, okay, poverty is a state of mind, you know, also. And so if they're not bringing people out of that process with education, the institution of slavery has guaranteed poverty for Black people. So the first step in that is to come out of that with with reparations. You have to empower the people. We have to be funded for what we have made contributions for, because the people who are successful in America, they were never enslaved. They're the ones who benefited the most from it. And so they have those resources that allow them to build private schools and private universities and to afford whatever it is that allows them to control these systems. So on the flip side, if we're really serious about undoing this, then we have to start with the resources being put into the communities and for the people to be able to do it. If it's done any other way, I don't see any kind of way, no matter who's involved or how it's done, I don't see how it can work.
Those are totally valid points. I just quickly wanted to clarify what I meant when I said do them correctly. And that's very bare minimum, right? Is like ensure that there is oversight of those dollars, public dollars, our dollars, so that billions of dollars don't continue disappearing into the pockets of wealthy white people, right? Like, so basic accountability and transparency measures. And then also, I think we need to ensure that schools or institutions that are receiving public dollars don't discriminate, period. I mean, in Nebraska, some of the bills that have been proposed that would privatize our school system don't do that. They don't protect, I think, against any form of discrimination, except, of course, they say race, but we know well that they'll go use any other explanation, right? And it'll really be that. So we just need to be wary.
Yes, thank you so much for that clarification.
I just want to add a little bit to it.
Max, okay.
I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey. Paterson, New Jersey is famous for East Side High School, my school. Those who know about the movie Lean On Me, that's the environment I came up in, where we had abject poverty and the schools reflected that. And it was impossible to get any kind of real education under the conditions that we were living in. And if you go further back, you know that in many instances, the school's funding was dependent upon the revenue that was coming from housing taxes. And if you didn't own any houses, if you didn't own any property, then your schools wasn't getting any money. But right next door and in the city right next to us, they had these wonderful schools with all the books that they needed, all the computers that they needed. And we didn't have nothing. We couldn't even get repairs. We had rats and roaches in our schools. That's what we had. So that school to prison pipeline is very real, as Melina mentioned. And that's where it all begins, when we start the criminalization of people of color at ages as low as kindergarten. And we punish them at higher rates, we suspend them at higher rates. And almost a year, 2 years ago to the day is the day that we all saw the school resource officers beating up a young 15-year-old girl in high school here in South Carolina, tossing her around the school. And the whole country was up in arms about that. So these are the issues we're dealing with when it comes to public education. It's not something I'm an expert in, so I'm not gonna say too much, but I do know my own experiences growing up in Paterson, New Jersey.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. I definitely, as a school administrator in a charter school, I definitely understand from the component of children coming into a school district that may not necessarily fit the looks of their community, so being at a disadvantage, just because your parents are trying to afford you a quality education, but it may not be advantageous to your regular, usual, customary environment. And so you find yourself, or some of those children find themselves in a place of disenchantment because they don't fit in. They may not have the means to kind of go along with what their peers have, and that's a whole nother issue. So I thank you guys for bringing that all like full circle for us in this conversation. Let's see, it's 8:36. I think we'll go ahead and just conclude for tonight. I want to thank everyone for coming. This was big. This was a really powerful night. I thank you, Melina. I thank you, Max. Thank you, Binu, for hopping in. I want to discuss with you guys who will be on tomorrow so that you guys can return tomorrow. This is just day 2 of our 4-day event of Free the 13th. And we want to make sure that the voices are heard and that the education is out there and that we are creating the awareness that's necessary in order to source the resources, source the additional hands in order to get some of this hard work done. Looks like tomorrow we have, let's see, Binu, Yusuf, and Noob. And it looks like we will be discussing a multitude of different things from the dawn of the information, outsourcing and competing with China, government and corporate collusion, the return of convict leasing and prison industries, and liberate the caged voices. So I thank you all for staying on with us tonight, even through any technical difficulty. It is most appreciated. And so I look forward to being here with you all tomorrow at this same time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email the link that is on the flyer or email the email that is on the flyer. Thank you so much for your time today, both Max and Melina. It was very much appreciated and necessary. Thank you all. You all have a great night.
Good night. Peace.
Thank you. Good night.